if we go to our bracketing control, we have two different options. The first is the interval in between shots. In this case, I've got it set to 2, and the other one is the number of shots, which in this case is set to 0. So in this case, we want to set the increment between shots at 1 exposure stop, and we want to have a total of 9 shots. So it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now, so if I set my focus to manual exposure and I have my drive mode as continuous shooting, then when I press the shutter release button and hold it, it goes something like this. You can hear the different lengths of the shutter speed. So let's look at, I'm focusing right now on a picture here in my studio. So let's look at these different images to see what they look like. So if we start off with the last one, let's go all the way back to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So the first one is the exposure that we set. So right now I've set it at the 60th of a second shutter speed and the f-stop and the ISO or whatever they are. So now if we go back to the first image, we're going to see that the shutter speed is now 1,000th of a second, which is 4 stops down. The next one is 500th of a second, which is 3 stops down. 2/50th of a second, which is 2 stops down. And then 1/25th of a second, which is 1 stop down. So it takes the base exposure, and it goes 4 down, 3 down, 2 down, 1 down. And then the next one is 1 up, which is 1/30th of a second. 2 stops up, which is 1/15th of a second, 3 and 4. So the basic sequence goes something like this. It goes base exposure, 4 down, 3 down, 2 down, 1 up, 2 up, 3 up, 4 up. So that's the sequence that the Nikon, in my case, I've set it to shoot in this order. And if you want to change that, you can go to the menu. I've got it highlighted here. This is under the custom setting bank. There's one called bracketing flash. And if you choose that one, you can come down here and you can choose the bracketing order. And in this case, I select that. I have the metered exposure and then the underexposed ones and then the overexposed. And if you'd rather start off with the underexposed one, this is more of a, I guess, a logical point of view, but I've been just doing this forever. You can choose which of these orders you want. And that's basically all there is to it. So I hope that helps. All right, so we're going to focus our attention on these settings just here. And the task at hand is to go from 1/1000th of a second all the way up to 4 seconds. We're going to do that in 2 separate operations. First, we're going to set our base shutter speed at 1/60th of a second. And then if we go 1, 2, 3, 4 stops down, bracketing, that takes us to 1/1000th of a second. 1, 2, 3, 4 stops up, that takes us to 1/4 of a second. If we then change for the second set, our base exposure to 1/4 of a second, 4 stops down from that goes down to 1, 2, 3, 4, a 60th of a second. And then there's some overlap there, obviously. And then 4 stops above that goes half a second, 1 second, 2 seconds to 4 seconds. So that's how we go from 4 seconds to 1/1000th of a second using bracketing. So we have this overlap here between these images, but basically we would choose a 60th of a second for the first base and then 1/4 of a second and just go back and forth between those, as I'm about to show you an example of that. So now we have our bracketing sequence set up so that we're doing a total of 9 shots, 1 exposure. So 9 shots, 1 exposure stop apart. And if we start off with a 60th of a second, then when we press and hold the shutter release button, we get these 9 shots. And as we saw earlier, that goes from 1,000th of a second all the way up to 1/4 of a second. But now if we want to go to an even longer time, all we have to do is to go to our base exposure and change that to 1/4 of a second. So let's do that now. This is what we would do during the eclipse very, very quickly. And now when I press and hold the shutter release button, let's see what we've got. Everything's going to be wildly overexposed, but we can see the exposure sequence here. And that is, if we now go back to So if we go back to, that's the last one. Go back to so that's the base exposure at 1/4 of a second. And now 4 down is a 60th of a second, a 30th of a second. I'm looking right there. 15th of a second, 1/8 of a second, half a second is one up, a second, 2 seconds, and 4 seconds. So in a nutshell, that's how we go between 4 seconds and an 8,000th of a, 1/1000th of a second, is to alternate between a metered exposure, if you will, of 1/4 of a second. Then we'd go, we got to go back to the 60th of a second. We'd go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then we go charging back to 1/4 of a second. Oh, the eclipse is happening. The eclipse is happening. And just keep doing this over and over and over again. That way we'd span the whole range of shutter speeds. So that's the second part of the story.